A whisper in the war rooms. The war did not begin with explosions for Jonathan Hale. It began with a whisper, quiet, almost invisible, buried deep inside a string of numbers intercepted from a German U-boat off the Atlantic coast. While the world roared with tanks, bombers, and speeches, Hale heard something else, a pattern hidden beneath the noise. And that whisper, faint as it was, would push him into the center of one of the most consequential secrets of World War II. Before the war, Jonathan Hale was no soldier. He was a quiet mathematician from Ohio, the kind of man neighbors greeted kindly but forgot minutes later. He had spent his youth solving puzzles no one asked him to solve, prime number sequences, unsolvable riddles, obscure cipher experiments. When he won a scholarship to MIT for his work in cryptanalysis, professors told him he possessed a mind built for invisible battles. By 1942, invisible battles had become the Allies' most desperate frontier. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, was confronting a brutal truth. German U-boats were sinking Allied supply ships faster than they could be replaced. Something had to change, and fast. And so, Jonathan Hale found himself summoned to a gray, windowless building outside Washington, D.C., a place no signs marked and no official acknowledged. It was known only to those within as Room 214, one of the early American code-breaking units working in tandem with the British at Bletchley Park. Inside, the air hummed with whispered conversations, tapping typewriters, and the smell of burnt coffee. Men and women bent over enemy intercepts, trying to decode the mind of the German war machine. But every day, more ships fell to the wolf packs. Then, one night, while sifting through a pile of seemingly routine intercepts, Hale noticed something odd. The message looked any other encrypted German transmission, long, complex, impossible to break without an Enigma machine. But at the very end, 3 digits repeated in a way that nagged at his memory. He pulled older intercepts, scanning for the same pattern. There it was again, and again, appearing every 6 or 7 days. To most analysts, it was nothing, static, a coincidence, an operator's habit. But Jonathan Hale didn't believe in coincidence. He approached his supervisor, a stern Army colonel who barely had patience for theoretical thinking. "Hale, are you telling me the Germans accidentally left the same numbers behind multiple times?" "No, sir," Hale replied softly. "I'm saying they didn't leave it accidentally at all." The colonel sighed. "And what does it mean?" "Sir, I think it's a key." A hush fell over the nearby desks. Hale explained that the repeated digits could indicate a weak point in the Enigma operator's behavior, something human, something predictable. If the Germans used those digits at the same moment in their daily key settings, the Allies might exploit it to break into a portion of their Atlantic communications. The colonel wasn't convinced, but the head of Navy intelligence overheard the conversation and stepped in. "Run with it," she said, handing Hale a stack of additional intercepts. "If you're wrong, we lose a few hours. If you're right, you save the Atlantic." Jonathan Hale didn't sleep for 3 days. He filled chalkboards with equations, scribbled on napkins, ran calculations until his eyes burned. Finally, on the 4th night, something clicked. The whisper became a voice. The repeating digits weren't random. They were tied to the movement schedules of the U-boats themselves. Each operator, without realizing it, had a habit of resetting the Enigma rotor positions before long-range transmissions. That habit created a predictable vulnerability, and Hale had just mapped it. If the pattern held, the Allies could begin decrypting German Atlantic communications hours after interception, fast enough to warn convoys, redirect escort ships, even ambush U-boats. But there was one problem. No one at the time believed the Americans alone could crack these Enigma-layered messages. The British had decades of cryptoanalytic experience. Bletchley Park housed the world's greatest codebreakers. Hale knew he needed them. A secure line was opened across the Atlantic. In the dim glow of room 214, Hale explained the pattern to a British cryptoanalyst named Arthur Denham, a man whose voice carried exhaustion, brilliance, and a hint of skepticism. "You're suggesting the Germans have been sloppy?" Denham asked. "No," Hale replied. "I'm suggesting they're human." Silence. Then Denham said, "Bloody hell, this might actually work." Combined teams from the U.S. and Bletchley Park set to work. For the first time, British cryptoanalysts watched Americans provide a key insight that could shift naval warfare. They built new analytic tables, reprogrammed early mechanical deciphering devices, and soon, after hours of tension, a decrypted message spilled onto Denham's typewriter. It detailed a coordinated wolf pack attack planned within the next 48 hours on a supply convoy leaving Halifax. The room froze. Hale's chest tightened. "Sir, if this is real, we need to move now." It was real. The U.S. Navy rerouted the convoy, deployed aircraft, and positioned destroyers ahead of time. When the German U-boats arrived at the predicted point, they found nothing but empty waves. Several were then hunted down as they tried to reposition. For the first time in months, the Atlantic went eerily quiet. Jonathan Hale's discovery didn't end the war, not yet, but it changed the tempo. By mid-1943, U-boat losses skyrocketed. Supply ships began reaching Europe safely, and Allied momentum grew stronger. But victory came at a cost. The Germans eventually realized something was wrong. Their messages were being intercepted too precisely, their positions guessed too easily. In response, they upgraded Enigma procedures, tightening the code Hale had once slipped through. Once again, room 214 was filled with tension. Fear whispered through the halls. If the Germans had sealed the vulnerability, Hale's breakthrough might collapse. But the months gained had already shifted the balance of the war. Convoys arrived when they needed to. Tanks, fuel, soldiers, all reached the shores of North Africa, Sicily, and eventually Normandy. Historians would later say that the Allies' ability to cross the Atlantic intact was one of the decisive factors of the war.
And yet, Jonathan Hale remained a ghost. His work was buried under layers of secrecy. No medals, no newspaper headlines, not even a footnote in most military briefings. His contributions were stamped classified, locked away in heavy cabinets, and forgotten by everyone except those who had worked alongside him. Years later, after the war, Hale returned to Ohio. He taught mathematics at a quiet college, walked to work every day, and never mentioned the whisper that had changed the course of history. His neighbors still greeted him kindly and still forgot him minutes later. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone with an old notebook filled with faded numbers, crossed-out patterns, and hurried calculations from those tense days in room 214. He would run his finger over the pages and remember the moment the whisper became a voice loud enough to shake the war. And he would think, not with pride, but with quiet amazement. Sometimes, victory does not come from the loudest generals, but from the quietest minds.
Broken keys of an unbreakable machine. The message arrived inside a plain brown envelope. No seal, no signature, no hint of the chaos it carried. When Jonathan Hale unfolded the thin sheet of paper, he expected another routine cipher intercept from the Atlantic front. Instead, he found a string of symbols he had never seen before. Symbols that, according to Allied intelligence, should not exist. The moment he looked at it, a chill crept through him. For months, Hale's work in the secretive Room 214 had given the Allies a rare advantage over German U-boats, but now everything he had built was on the brink of collapse. The Germans had not only changed their encryption methods, they had introduced something darker, sharper, more complex. A new cipher, a new machine. And with it, a rumor whispered through British and American intelligence networks. The Axis has built an unbreakable code. To anyone else, it was a threat. To Jonathan Hale, it was a challenge, one he could not afford to lose. Europe in flames. By late 1942, Europe looked like a continent carved by fire. German forces had swallowed nations whole, from Poland's plains to the cliffs of France. In North Africa, Rommel's tanks carved through the desert. And Russia, the carnage at Stalingrad reached unimaginable depths. And in the Atlantic Ocean, U-boats, deadly steel predators, continued sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate. Despite Hale's earlier breakthroughs, the tide was far from secure. Then came the intercept that changed everything. British analysts at Bletchley Park flagged a series of encrypted transmissions unlike any they had seen. The structure of the messages did not match Enigma. It was too layered, too irregular. Word spread like wildfire among cryptanalysts. The Germans were using a modified machine, something the Allies had not yet identified. When the first American intercept of this new cipher landed on Hale's desk, his supervisor simply said, "Hale, whatever this is, it's beyond us, but Command wants you on it. They think you see patterns the rest of us miss." He wanted to argue. He wasn't a magician, he reminded himself. But the truth was, he felt a pull, a whisper like before, a subtle rhythm hidden inside the chaos. He squared his shoulders, pushed aside his fatigue, and began. A machine with too many teeth. The new cipher was a nightmare. Every codebreaker knew Enigma was dangerous because of its rotating wheels and electrical pathways. Each key press created a new substitution, making traditional breaking methods useless. But this new variant seemed to shift layers of encryption mid-transmission, producing a cipher that twisted upon itself like a Mobius strip. He thought at first it might be a manual variant, but the irregularity was too precise. Only a machine could do this. A machine with too many teeth. Working through the night, Hale filled entire chalkboards with equations, rota possibilities, statistical frequency charts. Nothing matched. No known machine behaved this way. When dawn reached Washington, room 214 looked like a war zone. Papers everywhere, ashtray full, chalk best hanging in the air. Hale had made no progress. But he had made an observation. The cipher did not behave randomly. It behaved angrily, as if designed to thwart not just analysis, but him personally. He pushed the thought aside. He was exhausted. Sleep-deprived minds played tricks. Then, at 9:17 a.m., the secure line rang. "Hale, this is Denham." Arthur Denham, one of Bletchley Park's top analysts, had been part of the earlier collaboration that helped Hale identify the U-boat transmission flaw. They'd never met in person, yet Denham's dry wit and sharp mind had carved a sense of camaraderie between them. "We've seen your intercept," Denham said. "We believe it comes from a variant of the Enigma used by the Abwehr, German military intelligence." "The Abwehr," Hale repeated. "I thought they relied on standard Enigma." "Not anymore," Denham replied grimly. "We've confirmed the existence of a new machine, the Sondermaschine 7. The Germans claim it's unbreakable." Hale stared at the cipher sheet. "Unbreakable is a challenge, not a fact." Denham laughed, tired but genuine. "That's why I called." Together, over the crackling transatlantic line, they compared notes. Denham confirmed Hale's suspicion. The machine used 2 layers of encryption simultaneously, each shifting independently. Imagine a lock where both the key and the tumblers move. That's what we're dealing with. Then we need to stop the tumblers. Precisely. And that's why we need your mind. Blueprints in the dark. For the next 6 weeks, Hale lived 2 lives. The man who existed on paper and the man who lived in numbers. He ate when someone reminded him, slept on a cot in room 214, dreamed in symbols, woke with theories clawing at his mind. He built models of the new machine using wooden gears, springs scavenged from typewriters, and coils borrowed from Army signal receivers. The prototype rattled like a broken clock, but its logic grew clearer with each day. The Sounder Machine 7 did not encrypt messages linearly. It worked like a braid, 3 rotor sets weaving through one another, each resetting the other at unpredictable intervals. It was genius. Terrifying genius. But genius came with flaws. Hale noticed microscopic irregularities in the timing, tiny pauses, fractions of a second, when the machine shifted layers too quickly. Operators would unknowingly press keys too fast or too slow, interrupting the perfect rhythm. Human error. His old enemy, and his greatest ally. With that realization came a spark, faint at first, then growing. The machine wasn't unbreakable. It was breakable through the human operating it.
The key hidden in a mistake. On a cold February night, while scanning yet another transmission, Hale found it. A micro-pattern, a brief stutter in the cipher sequence. 3 characters repeated in a way that should have been impossible. Impossible meant human. Hale's heart quickened. He pulled older intercepts, overlaying them like transparency sheets. Slowly, a pattern emerged. A German operator, likely stationed in Belgium, had a habit of tapping the return key slightly early when sending updates. That single mechanical quirk, repeated across dozens of messages, produced a signature that Hale could exploit. He rushed to the secure line. "Denham, I found it, a micro-pattern, operator-induced. It creates a predictable overlap between the 2 encryption layers." Silence. Then, "You magnificent lunatic! Send me everything!" They worked across continents for 3 more days, barely speaking, barely breathing, until finally a clear German message rolled out of the machine. Coordinates, troop movements, supply logistics. It worked. They had cracked the unbreakable. The secret war turns. Within days, Allied commanders redirected operations using intelligence from Hale's breakthrough. Convoys avoided traps. Saboteurs intercepted Abwehr agents. American and British forces gained insight into German counterintelligence plans. One decrypted message revealed a planned sabotage of Allied factories in New York. Another exposed a German spy ring embedded within neutral Portugal. A third unveiled troop movements that would later influence key decisions in Italy. The Sounder Machine 7, once feared, became a tool for Allied victory. But there was a cost. The Germans noticed. When a high-ranking Abwehr officer reviewed intercepted battle reports, he realized their most secure machine had been compromised. The order went out: replace all Sondermaschine 7 units immediately. Eliminate every operator who might have made mistakes. Hale felt a hollowness in his chest when Denham told him the news. "I didn't want anyone to die," Hale whispered. "You didn't kill them," Denham said quietly. "Their war did." The weight of genius. With the machine replaced, the window closed, but the damage was done. The intelligence gathered during those critical months became a turning point in the shadow war of codes and countermeasures. Hale's name appeared nowhere. Not in newspapers, not in official reports.
not even in internal memos. His work was stamped top secret and locked away. He wasn't a soldier on the battlefield. He wasn't a pilot flying into fire. He was the man behind the curtain, not invisible, but forgotten. Yet in moments of reflection, he realized something profound. Some heroes saved lives by pulling triggers. Others saved lives by preventing the need for triggers at all. And the code he broke, once thought invincible, became a story whispered among analysts at Bletchley and Washington. Unbreakable machines don't fail, but their operators do. And sometimes one quiet man, listening closely enough, can hear the crack.
Midnight sparks in the listening stations. The first time Jonathan Hale heard it, he thought it was nothing but static, random noise, the kind that filled every radio room from Washington to London. But deep inside that static, beneath the crackling hum of midnight transmissions, he caught something else, a flicker, a spark. And in war, sparks are never accidents. Hale leaned closer to the headphones, brow furrowed. The sound pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat hidden beneath the chaos of the airwaves. At first he doubted himself. The nights had grown long and sleepless. Exhaustion blurred lines and twisted shadows. Maybe it was just the fatigue talking. But then he heard it again. Not noise, not static. A signal, one that shouldn't exist. Room 214, America's rising intelligence hub, had been tasked with intercepting German high-frequency transmissions for months. But this sound was different. It didn't match Enigma patterns, abwehr variants, or any known access communication method. It had rhythm, intention, design. And in war, sparks are never accidents. Hale leaned closer to the headphones, brow furrowed. The sound pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat hidden beneath the chaos of the airwaves. At first he doubted himself. The nights had grown long and sleepless. Exhaustion blurred lines and twisted shadows. Maybe it was just the fatigue talking. But then he heard it again. Not noise, not static. A signal, one that shouldn't exist. Room 214, America's rising intelligence hub, had been tasked with intercepting German high-frequency transmissions for months. But this sound was different. It didn't match Enigma patterns, abwehr variants, or any known access communication method. It had rhythm, intention, design. And within seconds, Hale knew the war had shifted again. The Night Watchers. By 1943, Allied listening stations, clusters of radio operators scattered across remote coastlines, worked endlessly to record access transmissions. From Newfoundland's icy shores to the California coast, young men and women spent long nights tuning dial after dial, headphones pressed tight, chasing invisible whispers in the dark. To most, the work felt endless and unrewarding, hours of nothingness, static, faint blips of coded German chatter. But to Jonathan Hale, these faint transmissions were lifelines. Every frequency was a doorway, every flicker a clue. He spent his nights in the dim glow of desk lamps, surrounded by towers of paper, jittery Morse intercepts, oscillograph printouts, and reels of magnetic tape. The air always smelled of warm electronics and burnt coffee, a scent that clung to his clothes like a badge of duty. But tonight felt different. He replayed the spark again, slower, clearer, then inverted the frequency, then filtered out the static. What remained chilled him. It wasn't a message. It was pieces of a message, scattered across the frequency spectrum like shrapnel. Someone, somewhere in Nazi Germany, had developed a method of splitting encoded transmissions into fragments so small they sounded like random noise. Each fragment traveled on a separate frequency, and only when recombined would the original message exist. It was brilliance, It was madness, and it was far beyond anything the Allied encryption teams had prepared for. Fragmented transmissions, Hale whispered. Why would they do that unless they're hiding something big? He flagged the listening station in Maine. Begin recording on all side frequencies immediately. He contacted the Navy. We may be dealing with a new access broadcast system. And then he began the impossible task, reassembling the shards. The puzzle of echoes. Within 48 hours, fragments flooded room 214. Operators from Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the British Isles sent reels of recordings, random static punctuated by tiny sparks. The puzzle grew monstrous. Each spark lasted less than 1/10 of a second. Each contained only a few data points. But when Hale examined them in sequence, he felt the familiar thrill he had felt months earlier when he first cracked the Sondermaschine 7's operator flaw. This wasn't random. This was intentional fragmentation, and reassembling it would require a mind unburdened by the belief that something was impossible. Hale worked for 36 hours straight. He charted each spark by timestamp, grouped them, layered them, played them simultaneously, then inverted them, then reversed them. Nothing. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and felt a flash of discouragement, until he noticed something peculiar. Two fragments, recorded thousands of miles apart, had identical noise signatures. Background hum, static density, distortion pattern. They weren't separate signals at all. They were parts of the same broadcast, scattered across oceans. Hale froze. The Germans weren't sending a message. They were sending echoes, redundant pieces of a larger message, each designed to ensure the Allies could never intercept all fragments at once. But fate, or luck, had given Hale something the Germans never predicted. Multiple listening stations had captured overlapping fragments. It was just enough. The midnight reconstruction. Hale pushed all other tasks aside. Room 214 became a fortress of sound. Operators, analysts, and technicians crowded around as Hale attempted what many believed was a fool's errand, rebuilding an Axis message that had been torn apart and scattered like dust. He lined the fragments like puzzle pieces, assigned each a probability score, wrote 24 formulas for sequence reconstruction, used early American computing devices, heavy, loud, clunky, to align microbursts. Hours turned into days. It felt like assembling a broken mirror, but each shard belonged to a different mirror, and none had edges. Then, on the 5th day, a pattern emerged. A repeating string of characters, too short to be a full message, but unmistakable. 3, 9, 7, A, Q, 5. A key. A routing key. Hale's heart hammered. Restless analysts leaned closer. "This isn't the message," he murmured. "It's the address. The message is somewhere else." "Somewhere else?" a supervisor asked. "Where?" Hale pointed at the map of listening stations. "They're using geographic echo routing. Multiple broadcasts, multiple receivers. The real message isn't in the fragments at all. It's in the timing between them." Silence. Then realization rippled through the room. The Germans weren't hiding their message in the signals. They were hiding it in the silence.
The secret hidden in silence. Every radio operator knew that silence could be just as intentional as sound. But this was a leap in enemy sophistication no one expected. Hale measured the intervals between sparks. Seconds, fractions of seconds, some long, some short. He charted them, converting intervals into binary, binary into characters, characters into clusters. Slowly, painfully, words formed. Very faint, barely coherent, but real. Vorbereitung, Umleitung, Kommando. German words,
tactical terms. He decoded another line. Transport Mitte, Operation Falcon, 15th Mars. Operation Falcon, March 15th. Transport Center. His stomach dropped. He decoded more. Nordsee, Waffen, Verlegung. North Sea, V-weapons, transfer. He felt lightheaded. The Germans were planning to relocate components of their V-weapons, advanced rockets capable of striking London, Antwerp, and beyond. The Allied command had long feared that if these weapons moved out of known manufacturing centers, finding them again would be nearly impossible. This was not just an intelligence find. It was a miracle. Hale grabbed the secure line. "Get me Widdish command, now. I need Bomber Command and MI6, immediately." The strike before dawn. Within hours, bombers scrambled from British airfields. The information Hale reconstructed pointed to a remote transport line near the North Sea, rail lines the Allies had not targeted before. Bombers roared into the night sky. Floodlights swept across runways. Engines screamed as pilots pushed their planes to limits. And deep beneath Nazi Germany's blanket of secrecy, trains began rolling, carrying rocket components that could devastate entire cities. But this time, the Allies were waiting. At 2:14 a.m., the first Allied bomb struck the rail junction. At 2:19, the second wave hit the warehouses. By 3 a.m., the transport plan for Operation Falcon lay in ruins. British intelligence later confirmed that 3 V-weapon convoys had been completely destroyed. The Germans were stunned. How did the Allies know? They demanded. They suspected traitors, sabotage, internal leaks. Never once did they imagine the truth. The Allies had listened to silence and won. Echoes of a hidden victory. The operation was stamped ultra-secret, shared only with a handful of commanders. No medals, no public recognition, no parades. Jonathan Hale returned to his desk like any other day, quietly reviewing new intercepts, while the world outside continued unaware of how close Europe had come to disaster. Room 214 resumed its hum of typewriters and static-filled headphones. Analysts carried on, never knowing they stood on the shoulders of a single midnight discovery. But Hale knew. In the stillness between transmissions, he had heard the spark of something extraordinary, a sign that even the most brilliant enemy could make mistakes. And he understood now, more than ever, war was not always won by firepower. Sometimes it was won by listening closely enough to hear the secrets hidden in silence.
The burden of knowing too much. Each solved message carries a deadly weight, intelligence that could save thousands or doom those already in motion. The story. They say the hardest part of war isn't the battles you fight, but the truths you learn in silence. For most Americans, World War II was a clash of armies and nations. But for a small, hidden circle of minds working behind locked doors in an unmarked building in Washington, D.C., the war unfolded in dots, dashes, and encrypted riddles, messages that revealed horrors before they happened, victories before they were earned, and betrayals too dangerous to speak aloud. This is the story of one such codebreaker, an American cryptanalyst whose name history never recorded, but whose burden shaped the unseen front lines of the war. Chapter 1. The Room Without Windows. The workday began before dawn, always. The corridor smelled of burnt coffee and ozone from overworked radio machines humming through the night. The sign outside the door read only Research Division, but inside sat the beating heart of American wartime intelligence, the Signal Intelligence Service. He, let us call him Jonathan Miles, had joined as a mathematician, recruited not for muscle, but for the peculiar brilliance that made him see patterns where others saw noise. On paper, he was simply an analyst. In reality, he was one of the minds untangling Japan's diplomatic cipher machine, known to American intelligence as Purple. The room had no windows. That wasn't security. It was mercy. The horrors that filtered through decoded messages didn't need sunlight. Jonathan Laughlin said nothing in that room could be unseen. Every decrypted message changed something inside him. Some made his hands tremble. Some made him leave the room and sit on the cold floor outside with his head in his hands. Every message carried a weight, the burden of knowing too much. Chapter 2. The Message That Should Have Changed Everything. In late November 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan had reached a knife's edge. But in Room 2B, where Jonathan worked, the tension was spoken only through classified cables intercepted from Tokyo to its embassies. On December 6th, one day before Pearl Harbor, Jonathan cracked a message that made his blood turn to ice. A long, multi-part communication to Japan's Washington embassy. Orders to divide their message into sections and send them at precise intervals. Language that hinted at finality, at irreversible decisions. It didn't explicitly mention an attack, not directly, but Japan's military used separate channels, but the urgency was unmistakable. Jonathan decoded the final part at 9 p.m. He stood up. "They're signaling a break, a severing of relations," he whispered. His supervisor read the translation, brow furrowed. "This goes straight to the White House." Jonathan watched the message leave the room, watched an officer tuck it into a locked briefcase before rushing down the hall. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the crushing weight of a decoded truth he could not control. He had solved the puzzle, but he could not stop the gears of war already turning. The next morning, America awoke to fire, smoke, and devastation at Pearl Harbor. For the rest of his life, Jonathan wondered, if I had solved it faster, would it have mattered? The burden of knowing too much became a shadow he could never outrun. Chapter 3. Victory Built on Silence. After Pearl Harbor, the urgency intensified. The U.S. cracked Japan's naval cipher, JN-25, opening a window into the empire's military plans. Each decrypted message became a lifeline. Jonathan and his colleagues intercepted coordinates, fleet movements, and the chilling precision of Japan's planned conquests. In May 1942, Jonathan decrypted fragments of Japanese communications that mentioned a place the U.S. Navy barely regarded, an island called Midway. The messages were coded in riddles of water supply numbers, rendezvous times, and carefully disguised fleet designations. Jonathan spent 3 sleepless nights reconstructing the puzzle. On the morning of the 4th day, he burst through the office of Commander Rochefort. "They're coming to Midway," he said. "This is it, the attack point. The whole operation depends on it." The Navy listened. The U.S. prepared. And when Japan struck, America was waiting. Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. Thousands of American sailors never learned that their survival traced back to a mathematician in a room without windows. Jonathan could not speak of it, not to family, not to friends, not even to the soldiers his work saved. The secrecy was total. Victory, he learned, was built on silence. Chapter 4. the message he couldn't ignore. In 1944, when Allied forces closed in on the Philippines, Japanese forces began sending increasingly desperate communications. Jonathan decoded orders of scorched earth tactics, burning villages, executing prisoners, destroying food supplies. These messages clung to him like ghosts, but one message broke him. It was short, clinical, a set of coordinates, an instruction. If capture is imminent, execute prisoners immediately. Jonathan froze. The coordinates matched the location of a POW camp, one where American soldiers had been held since the Bataan Death March. Men who had survived starvation, disease, and unimaginable cruelty. Now, in one cold sentence, their fate was sealed. He felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders, only heavier this time, because this message wasn't a prediction, it was a death warrant. He reported the translation. High Command acted swiftly. The U.S. ordered a daring rescue raid, one that would be remembered as the raid at Cabanatuan. Dozens of Rangers and Filipino guerrillas stormed the camp, saving hundreds of American prisoners just hours before their scheduled execution. Jonathan cried quietly at his desk that night, not out of sadness, but relief. For once a message he decoded saved lives directly. But the weight of being the first to know, of being the one who read the order of death before it happened, never left him. Chapter 5. After the war, the silence didn't end. When the war finally ended in 1945, millions celebrated across America, streets filled with music, tears, and flags waving proudly. Jonathan didn't join the celebrations. He was in the same windowless room, packing his few belongings into a worn leather bag. His wartime service would remain secret. No medals, no public praise, no one beyond the intelligence community would ever know what he had done. He walked out of the building for the last time, the sunlight almost blinding after years of artificial lamps. People around him cheered, hugged, sang, but Jonathan felt detached, like a ghost drifting through his own country. Because he understood something few Americans ever would. Victory wasn't just won on the battlefield. It was written, guessed, decrypted, and carried on the backs of those who knew too much.
Chapter 6. The Burden That Never Lifted. Jonathan lived a quiet life afterward. He taught mathematics. He married. But some nights, while grading papers or reading by lamplight, a memory would return, a message in half-translated fragments, a list of casualties he could recite like a prayer, a line of code that had determined the fate of men he would never meet. He once told a colleague, late in his life, "The dead visit me sometimes, not in nightmares, but in numbers." He meant it literally. Every intercepted message was burned into his mind forever. The burden of knowing too much became the silent legacy of the Codebreakers, men and women whose brilliance changed the course of American history, but who carried the emotional cost alone. Jonathan Miles died in the early 1980s. His service records were declassified years later. His family discovered a stack of notebooks filled with patterns, diagrams, and cryptic strings of numbers. None of them knew what those numbers meant, but America owed him a debt it could never repay. Epilogue: The Hidden Heroes of History. Today, historians estimate that U.S. codebreakers shortened World War II by at least 2 years and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Their contributions, once sealed behind layers of wartime secrecy, now form one of the most extraordinary chapters of American intelligence history. But the greatest cost was never written in textbooks.
It lived inside the minds of people like Jonathan, people who fought a war without guns, who shaped fate with logic and instinct, and who bore the crushing knowledge of death and salvation in equal measure. The burden of knowing too much, a weight they carried so the world could one day live free.
Operation Ghost Thread. With the enemy closing in, the Codebreaker engineers a deception so daring that even Allied commanders hesitate to approve it. The story. They say the most dangerous weapon in war is not a bomb or a bullet, but a lie so perfect it becomes the truth. And in the winter of 1944, when the Allies were stretched thin across Europe, one American codebreaker engineered a lie so bold, so terrifyingly fragile, that history remembers it only in whispers. This is the story of Operation Ghost Thread, a deception that balanced the fate of thousands on a single filament of intelligence and nerve. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Noise. Before he became a ghost in military records, Elias Gardner was a quiet radio engineer from Ohio. He never imagined himself a soldier. He loved circuitry, puzzles, and the comforting predictability of machines. But war pulled men not for who they were, but for what they could do. By 1944, Elias had become one of the most gifted codebreakers in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. His job wasn't just to crack enemy messages, it was to understand them, to anticipate patterns, identify false leads, and uncover what the Germans tried hardest to bury. Deep inside a converted monastery in Belgium, Elias lived among static-filled radios, tangled wiring, and towers of intercepted German transmissions. He couldn't sleep more than a few hours. The Wehrmacht was approaching, pushing toward the Ardennes with a force no one had predicted. U.S. lines were thinning. Winter was closing in. And in those hours of chaos, Elias noticed something no one else did. The enemy was listening back. The Germans weren't just intercepting Allied communications, they were studying them, learning their rhythms, copying their voice. This was a battlefield of echoes, where information traveled faster than bullets. And soon, Elias realized, the Germans were preparing to strike exactly where the Allies were weakest. Chapter 2. A Pattern Too Perfect. It began with a handful of messages that felt wrong, too clean, too confidently transmitted. The Germans were sending encrypted updates to units in the Ardennes, but Elias noticed the repetition, the same key phrases, the same unusual spacing between numbers, the same style of operator fist, the subtle way each radio man tapped out Morse code. "Someone is centralizing their communications," Elias muttered, tapping a pencil against the desk. "No army does that unless they want us to notice it." He spent the next 3 nights reconstructing the pattern, building charts, scribbling notes. By dawn of the 4th day, he saw the truth. The Germans were feeding false information through channels they knew the Allies could intercept. They wanted the Allies to relax, and behind that deception, a massive offensive was forming. The Battle of the Bulge was coming. He ran to command headquarters with his findings. Commanders listened, nodded, but with stretched supply lines and exhausted troops, they could spare little to reinforce the Ardennes. "We'll prepare a small reserve, but nothing more until we're certain." Certain. Elias almost laughed. Certainty in war was a myth, unless he created it. Chapter 3. The Impossible Deception. That night, as icy winds rattled the monastery windows, Elias conceived a plan so insane he almost tore the idea from his mind. If Germany was feeding false intelligence, then the Allies could feed them a bigger lie. Not just a misleading message, not just a fake unit, but an entire phantom army. A force so convincingly documented, so flawlessly transmitted across radio channels that Germany would believe an entire corps of American reinforcements was assembling behind the Ardennes, exactly where the Germans intended to strike. He called it Operation Ghost Thread because it relied on weaving a single filament of truth into a web of lies. The operation required fake unit names, manufactured march schedules, artificial radio chatter, false supply requisitions, simulated traffic noise, and operators who could mimic the distinct fist of dozens of Allied radio men. Elias proposed that if they projected the illusion of a reinforced U.S. line, the Germans might hesitate, might delay their attack long enough for genuine reinforcements to arrive. Commanders stared at him like he'd lost his mind. It risks revealing our authentic positions, one warned. If they catch even a whiff of deception, we lose everything, another said. Elias knew they were right, but he also knew something else. If they did nothing, the Germans would break through within days. He took a breath. Let me build it. Give me 12 hours. Against every instinct of military caution, they agreed. Operation Ghost Thread was born. Chapter 4. Building a Ghost Army. Elias recruited 2 radio operators fluent in German patterns, a sound engineer from a propaganda unit, a truck mechanic who could simulate convoy noise, 3 linguists to craft believable chatter. They worked in frozen rooms with blackout curtains drawn tight. Supplies were scarce. Time was vanishing, but fear made them fast. Every hour brought the enemy offensive closer. Elias created fake call signs for the ghost units, 421st Armored Division, 132nd Mobile Artillery Battalion, Task Force Merrick. None existed, but on the airwaves they sounded real. They transmitted mock supply shortages, requests for gasoline, movement orders. They simulated trucks rumbling over frozen roads. They wove snippets of real Allied messages with carefully crafted lies. Their transmissions became a symphony of deception, quiet, precise, and deadly. By the second night, German intercepts shifted. The enemy adjusted reconnaissance flights. Rumors of American reinforcements circulated among German units. Elias exhaled. The thread was holding. Chapter 5. The Line Between Genius and Madness. The deception grew so effective that even some Allied units began to ask where these new reinforcements were stationed. Headquarters grew nervous. What if our own troops start moving based on this false intel? A colonel snapped. But Elias didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The Germans needed to believe. Then, on the third night, disaster struck. The monastery's radio generator sputtered, then died. Silence. Deadly, suffocating silence. Without power, the ghost army vanished, and if the Germans noticed, everything collapsed. Elias sprinted through the dark, snow crunching under his boots. He climbed onto the frozen generator housing with numb fingers. The mechanic worked beside him, hands shaking. "We have minutes before they realize the signal cut," Elias whispered. Sweat froze on his forehead. His breath burned in the cold. Inside the wires he saw not circuits, but soldiers who depended on this lie to stay alive. Then, the generator roared back to life. Elias raced to the radio room.
Operators resumed transmission seamlessly as if nothing had happened. The Ghost Army lived again, but Elias knew they were close, too close to disaster.
Chapter 6. The Enemy Hesitates. On December 15, 1944, German High Command issued the order. The Ardennes offensive was to begin immediately. But then, something changed. Intercepts revealed hesitation. A German colonel warned. American reinforcements reported near the northern ridge, movement unclear, recommend delaying armored advance until confirmation. Elias felt his knees weaken. Ghost Thread had worked. The Germans delayed their strike by 36 critical hours. It wasn't enough to stop the Battle of the Bulge, but it was enough to let 2 exhausted American divisions reposition themselves. Enough time for reinforcements to arrive from the north. Enough time to fortify the weakest line. The thread had held long enough to save thousands. The commanders who once doubted Elias shook his hand silently. Words weren't needed. Chapter 7. The Ghost Fades. When the offensive finally crashed through the Ardennes, the Allied line bent, but did not break. And when historians later studied the battle, they could never fully explain why the Germans hesitated at the last moment. Elias knew why. He knew his Ghost Army had whispered just loudly enough to change history. After the war, the details of Operation Ghost Thread were buried in classified files. Elias returned home, quietly repairing radios in Ohio, living a life no one realized had helped turn the tide of war. He never spoke of the operation. He never received a medal. He never wanted one. Years later, when parts of the operation were declassified, one historian wrote, "Sometimes victory hangs not on armies or generals, but on men who can make the enemy fear shadows." Elias Gardner had made them fear an army that never existed, and history moved because of it.
When the cipher strikes back. A sudden shift in enemy communication threatens to erase months of progress, pushing the silent genius to the breaking point. The story. Some battles are fought with guns. Others are fought with silence. The kind of silence that comes right before everything collapses. By early 1945, Elias Gardner, one of the most brilliant codebreakers in Allied intelligence, had spent 18 months unraveling the darkest secrets inside Nazi encrypted systems. His quiet breakthroughs had saved convoys, redirected bombers, and prevented catastrophic ambushes across Europe. But on a freezing February morning, inside a cramped underground listening station on the outskirts of Antwerp, everything changed. The cipher struck back. 1. The day the codes went dark. Elias had been awake for 30 hours when the first transmission arrived, a short burst of German Morse with a rhythm that felt familiar until it wasn't. He leaned forward, squinting at the printed strip of paper. "This can't be right," he whispered. The operator beside him raised an eyebrow. "Another weather report?" Elias shook his head. His fingers traced the characters like he was reading a dangerous pulse. "No, this is new, entirely new." For months, the Germans had relied on predictable variant patterns, tiny quirks in their Enigma procedures, sloppy habits repeated across the front. Elias had mapped them like constellations. He knew their fingerprints. But this was a clean slate. A new cipher table, a new transmission structure, a new encryption discipline. It was as if the Germans had burned their old playbook and written a new one overnight. And with that shift, months of painstaking Allied progress evaporated. 2. The silent panic. By noon, every listening post across Europe reported the same nightmare. German communications had gone dark behind an unbreakable wall. Decrypt rooms buzzed with frantic typing, officers barking orders, analysts flipping through codebooks like priests searching lost scripture. But no one could find a pattern. Without decrypted intelligence, Allied divisions would be blind. Supply convoys would sail into traps. Air missions would strike shadows instead of targets. And rumors whispered through command corridors. What if the Germans cracked our deception networks? What if they know our troop movements? What if this is the start of a counteroffensive? For the first time since the previous summer, the Allies felt fear. Elias felt something worse: failure. Everything he had built, every thread he had pulled from the enemy's secrets was unraveling. He stared at the new transmissions until his vision blurred, searching for anything familiar. But the cipher was silent, mocking, perfect. A message arrived from British intelligence at Bletchley Park. New German key structure confirmed, likely full system overhaul, all analysts to mobilize. Elias felt his chest tighten. They had to break this code, fast, or the war might find new life. 3. Cracks in the ice. By the second night, exhaustion gnawed at Elias like frostbite. He worked under flickering lamps, surrounded by stacks of intercepted messages, hundreds of encrypted signals, all useless. The Germans had shifted frequencies, switched cipher wheels, rewritten daily keys, changed operator habits. This wasn't an upgrade, it was a purge. And then, a flicker. A faint pattern emerged in one transmission. A short burst of German Morse with a rhythm that felt familiar, until it wasn't. He leaned forward, squinting at the printed strip of paper. "Error," he whispered. It had to be. Even the most disciplined radio men slipped when they were rushed or cold or hungry. A repeated pair meant human imperfection, a crack in the ice. He dug through previous messages, found another, then another. 3 cracks, 3 chances. And suddenly, Elias felt the old fire return. He mapped the repetition frequency, calculated wheel position likelihoods, cross-referenced old habits from specific German regiments. By dawn, he had reconstructed a partial key. "Bring this to Colonel Whitman," he told the operator, hands trembling. "I need all intercepts from the 9th Panzer Regiment. Their radio man is sloppy." This was how ciphers fell, not from brilliance, but from human cracks. 4. The cipher fights back. But the Germans were not sleeping. Their system was smarter than anything Elias had seen. As soon as one operator slipped, another compensated. Errors vanished, patterns flattened. The cipher shifted its rhythm like a living creature sensing it was being hunted. It was as if the cipher knew. Elias felt the pressure twisting inside him. He knew the truth. If the Allies didn't break the new system within days, German U-boats could cripple Atlantic supply lines. Panzer divisions could reposition without detection. V-weapon sites might strike newly liberated cities. Every hour they stayed blind cost lives, and the cipher was tightening its fist. 5. The breaking point. On the 4th night, a snowstorm slammed the listening station. Radio reception crackled. Elias's hands were stiff with cold. Officers murmured behind closed doors. Coffee tasted like ash. He was unraveling. He slammed a fist onto the table. There has to be something. People don't just become perfect overnight. He grabbed the latest intercepts, searching, scanning, desperate. And then, there it was. a faint transmission from a field unit near the Rhine. The operator used an outdated abbreviation, one banned under the new system. Elias froze. A single letter, misplaced, forgotten in haste, a letter that didn't belong. He pounced, calculating wheel placement, rotor mismatch, possible turnover positions. The room blurred around him. He scribbled numbers, matched frequencies, hammered on probability tables. His breathing turned shallow. And then, the cipher cracked open. Not fully, but enough. He stumbled into the command room, papers shaking in his hands. I have it. A partial key, enough to decode operational chatter from the Rhine, enough to predict their troop movements. Officers swarmed the pages, eyes widened, orders were shouted, runners sprinted to radio posts. Within hours, Allied bombers diverted just before flying into a German trap. Infantry units adjusted their flanks. A convoy rerouted through safe territory. The room buzzed with relief. Elias slumped into a chair, exhaustion overtaking him. But he wasn't relieved. He knew what this meant. The cipher would strike again, and next time they might not be so lucky. 6. A quiet victory. By the end of the week, enough cracks had been exploited for Bletchley Park and Allied stations to rebuild the German system's structure. Decrypts flowed once more. The crisis passed. The blindness lifted. But something fundamental had shifted inside Elias. He realized that code-breaking was never a war of dominance. It was a war of endurance. A duel where each side adapted, learned, countered, where victory was temporary, fragile. The enemy hadn't simply changed their cipher. They had reminded the Allies that intelligence was a living battlefield. When the final decrypted message of the day slid from the machine, Elias stared at it quietly. War wasn't just fought at the front. It was fought in rooms like this, where silence, pressure, and a single mistake could rewrite history. He exhaled, letting his mind settle. The cipher struck back, but he had struck harder. The message that turned the tide. One final coded transmission surfaces, a clue that could rewrite the outcome of a crucial battle, if it can be cracked in time. The story. Sometimes victory doesn't come from the loudest explosion on the battlefield, but from a whisper hidden inside a string of numbers. It was March 1945, and the war in Europe hung on a razor's edge. Though the Allies were advancing, German resistance was fierce, unpredictable, and increasingly desperate. Every piece of intelligence mattered. Every intercepted signal could mean the difference between a safe crossing or a slaughter. For Elias Gardner, America's quiet code-breaking genius, the war felt like a long hallway with doors that opened only when he bled time and sleep into his calculations. But on a rainy night inside the dimly lit Allied decrypt station in Luxembourg, a single transmission changed everything. The impossible burst of static. The message arrived that 0214 hours, carried through a storm of interference and static so intense the operator first believed it was atmospheric noise. But Elias knew better the moment the paper strip printed onto the desk. The numbers were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Origin? Elias asked. Somewhere near the rear pocket, but the signal was weak. Could be mobile. A mobile transmitter meant danger. Mobile units moved with purpose, usually preparing an ambush, a retreat, or a last stand. Elias scans the ciphertext. It wasn't like the new German ciphers they'd been dealing with for weeks. This one was older, structured around a pattern he hadn't seen since early '44. Why would the Germans revert to an outdated encryption? Unless... It's a fallback system, Elias whispered. They're scrambling. Something big is happening. I, racing the clock. The message was short, just 97 characters, but Elias knew brevity often hid the most important secrets. He spread his charts across the table, his pencil smudging the edges. The hours passed like minutes. The storm outside rattled the metal shutters, radios crackled. Officers stomped in and out of the room asking if anything had been found. Elias ignored them all. This message mattered. German forces were trapped in the Ruhr region, over 300,000 troops fighting with dwindling supplies. If the Allies could predict their breakout attempt, they could end the campaign weeks sooner. But if the Germans slipped through, the war would drag on. More towns destroyed, more lives lost. The paper in front of him might prevent that, or condemn them all. I. The key hidden in a mistake. By dawn, Elias had traced 3 possible wheel positions for the cipher. None fit. His head throbbed, coffee tasted metallic, his hands shook from exhaustion. But then, a single irregularity caught his eye. A double letter. German operators were trained never to repeat a character in certain positions. It created predictable vulnerabilities. But here, in the middle of the message, was a repetition so obvious it was either a trap or a mistake. "Thank you," Elias breathed, feeling adrenaline push back the fog of fatigue. He recalculated using the forbidden repetition as a crib, a known plain text anchor. The cipher wheel alignment shifted, characters reordered, and suddenly, a phrase emerged. Verlagerung 6B, relocation 6B. His stomach tightened. That code phrase had appeared once before, months earlier in encrypted field directives. It referred to a high-risk evacuation maneuver, a coordinated breakout attempt using decoy units. If the Germans were planning a breakout through the southern corridor, they could hit the American Ninth Army completely unprepared. The message wasn't just important, it was catastrophic. I, the final reveal. Elias worked feverishly now, completing the decryption line by line. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the cold. More fragments appeared. Heute Nacht, tonight. Unter schwerem Nebel, under heavy fog. Panzerreserve Ost, Eastern Armored Reserve. Angriffsroute 5, attack route 5. When he wrote the final phrase, he froze. Brücke 14 must hold. Bridge 14. He knew that location. Every intelligence officer knew it. It was the narrowest crossing on the Ruhr River, lightly defended, overlooked, considered tactically insignificant. But in a fog-covered night assault, it could become the Germans' escape hatch. If they broke out there, tens of thousands of seasoned troops might flee, regroup, and prolong the war. Elias shoved back his chair and ran. V. The tide turns. General Whitman read the decrypted message twice, jaw tightening. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. Elias nodded. "If they take Bridge 14 tonight, they'll flood the valley by dawn. We won't stop them." Whitman exhaled. "Then we move now." Orders crackled through field radios. Tanks rumbled to new positions. Artillery units recalibrated. Engineers raced to reinforce Bridge 14. Infantry battalions adjusted their lines in the fog. And just after midnight, German armor emerged from the mist. Dozens of tanks, hundreds of infantry, a last desperate attempt to break the encirclement. But instead of empty roads and tired American patrols, they found a wall of firepower waiting for them. The battle lasted 3 hours. The Germans never made it to the bridge. The breakout collapsed. Historians would later say the Battle of the Ruhr ended not on the riverbanks, but in a listening station, in the hands of a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos. VII, the whisper that ended a war. When the sun rose, the fog lifted, revealing thousands of German soldiers surrendering in the valley. General Whitman found Elias still at his desk, pale and exhausted. "You turned the tide," the general said quietly. "One message, one mind." Elias didn't answer at first. He looked at the decrypted strip, just 97 characters that reshaped the final chapter of the war. "It wasn't me," he said softly. "It was a mistake, a double letter." Whitman smiled. "In war, sometimes that's all the truth we get." And with that, Elias Gardner, a man with no medals, no battlefield glory, no fame, became the silent force who closed the last escape route of a collapsing regime. A whisper in the static, a pattern in the noise, the message that turned the tide.
A victory without a name. If history were honest, it would carve certain names into monuments of light, names of people who saved millions without ever stepping onto a battlefield. But some victories are won in shadows, and some heroes are destined to remain invisible. This is the story of one such ghost in history, a codebreaker whose triumph shaped the future of nations, yet whose name never appeared in any headline, medal list, or parade. They called him the Listener, though he never touched a radio. His real domain was a cramped decoding hut on the outskirts of Bletchley Park, a place where windows stayed covered and clocks mattered less than the steady rhythm of panic and hope. His name, Samuel Hart, was known to only a handful of officers, all bound by oaths of secrecy so strict that even their families could never know the magnitude of what they guarded. By 1944, the war's tide was shifting, but every day carried new horrors, new risks, and new encrypted messages that could alter the course of entire campaigns. Hart had spent years cracking access ciphers, peeling apart codes through a combination of logic, obsession, and something that could only be described as intuition. While others saw patterns, Hart sensed them, an almost eerie ability to read the enemy's mind through the cold structure of numbers. His hands were always ink-stained, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. But those who worked beside him believed one thing with absolute certainty. This quiet mathematician was as essential to the Allied cause as any general. Then came the order that would silence his legacy forever. The final cipher. It arrived on a rainy August night, a scrap of intercepted transmission routed to Hut 6. Nothing about it seemed unusual. The Axis sent thousands of messages daily, many of them routine. But this one carried an urgency the cryptographers could feel before they could prove. Encrypted in a rare variation of the Enigma setting, the message resisted every method the team threw at it. Machines jammed, notations failed, and the usual statistical shortcuts came up empty. Hart leaned over the paper, tracing the lines with a fingertip. "This isn't routine," he murmured. He was right. Within hours, they discovered inconsistencies suggesting the cipher was masking high-level troop movement. But whose and where? The Allied commanders were planning several simultaneous operations. Any one of them could be devastated if the enemy had a counterplan in motion. The clock was ticking.
Every hour of delay meant potential death somewhere on the continent. Hart isolated himself, refusing to leave the hut. He skipped meals, ignoring the concerned glances of the operators who passed him tea. His chalkboard filled with improbable equations, strings of symbols and diagrams that looked like maps of thought rather than calculations. But at the core, he was fighting exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that even a perfect solution might come too late. By dawn, he found the pattern. "It's a redeployment," he whispered, voice barely carrying. "They're reinforcing the Ardennes." The implications hit the room instantly. A concentrated Axis push there, at that moment, could crush the thin Allied lines positioned after the liberation of Paris. The incoming winter would only make the situation worse. Hart pressed the decoded sheet into the hands of the duty officer. "They mean to strike before snowfall." The message raced across secure channels to Supreme Allied headquarters. Within hours, defensive plans were redrawn, troop movements accelerated, and supply convoys rerouted. What might have become a catastrophic surprise offensive, what history would later call the Battle of the Bulge, instead met an Allied force far more prepared than the Axis expected. Thousands lived because one man solved an impossible code overnight. The silence after victory. When the war ended the next year, Europe celebrated in the streets. Bells rang, flags waved, soldiers embraced. But at Bletchley Park, the celebration was hushed. Hart and the others received no parades. Instead, they were handed sealed papers and a single command: tell no one. Not now, not ever. Their work, the officers said, was too critical to expose. Revealing their role might compromise future intelligence efforts. History will understand one day, they were promised. But history had a long memory for generals and a short one for ghosts. Hart returned to America with nothing but a suitcase and permanent insomnia. He took a small teaching job at a state college where his students remembered him as brilliant but distant. He never married. He rarely spoke about the past. When colleagues asked where he had served during the war, he simply replied, "Communications work." He lived quietly, anonymously, the war fading behind him like a dream too heavy to lift. Yet every December, when news documentaries revisited the chaos of the Ardennes, Hart would pause. He would listen as commentators described how intelligence had allowed Allied forces to brace early for the German attack. The reports always credited Allied code-breaking efforts in vague, sweeping terms. Never a name, never his. A file unsealed too late. Decades later, long after Hart had passed away in a modest home in Ohio, the British government began declassifying wartime intelligence archives. Scholars rushed to explore the files, uncovering stories of unsung heroes. Among them was an unnamed American cryptanalyst whose decoding of a rare Enigma variant had influenced Allied readiness before the German winter offensive. Researchers cross-referenced travel logs, assignment lists, and decoding hut rosters. Slowly, a name emerged: Samuel Hart. But the world had changed. Few were left who remembered the war firsthand. Hart's relatives, distant cousins, were stunned to discover their quiet, soft-spoken family member had helped alter the course of history. Historians published papers, documentaries mentioned him in single sentences. But there were no medals, no ceremonies, no monuments. Just a story in a file that survived long enough for someone to open it. The quiet legacy. Today, cryptologists and military historians speak of code-breaking as one of the silent pillars of Allied victory. They teach students that wars are won not only with tanks and aircraft, but with minds sharp enough to see patterns where others seek chaos. And somewhere in that lineage, Samuel Hart lives on. A victory without a name, a hero without applause. A man who saved a continent and asked for nothing. Because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones whispered, not shouted. And sometimes the fate of nations turns not on battlefield thunder, but on the quiet scratching of a pencil in a dimly lit hut, as a lone mathematician decides the future.